Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 8th South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme is The Politics of Hope, People's Resilience and Resistance in Catastrophic Times. Today, we have a lecture on ecology, socialism, and the future of history by Professor John Bellamy Foster. We provide English, Chinese, and Spanish simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of the computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Elena Hardens, Melissa Ruffini, Huang Xiaomei, and Li Menghong. First, may I introduce the co-moderators for today's session. My name is Shirche Margaret Jadi. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Rural Reconstruction of China in Southwest University in China. I am board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives and one of the founding members of Global University for Sustainability. I have been actively involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China since 2000. Professor Paulo NAKATANI is a professor at the Department of Economics and at the postgraduate program in social policy at the Federal University of Espírito Santo in Brazil. He was former president of the Brazilian Society of Political Economy from 2008 to 2012. He is member of Latin American Society of Political Economy and Critical Thinking, International Observatory of the Crisis, and of Global University for Sustainability. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Picardie in France. Thank you very much. Please, Professor NAKATANI.
I'm introducing Professor John Bellamy Foster. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and editor of Monthly Review. He published several books on ecology, including The Vulnerable Planet, Marx Ecology, Hungry for Profit, Ecology Against Capitalism, The Ecological Revolution, The Ecological Rift, What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, and Marx and the Earth, and the robbery of nature. His latest book is The Return of Nature, Socialism and Ecology. He is the winner of the Deutsche Memorial Prize 2020. Dear John, you can speak.
I'm very pleased to be here and in the Global University and South-South Forum. And what I want to talk about is, I'm going to present what's basically a conclusion to a book I have written that is coming out in a year, but it's very much oriented to the topic of this conference as well. And I wanted to address the issue of how the future seems closed. So often we're told there are no alternatives. There's no way of going forward. And certainly we're in a very, very serious crisis with climate change and the pandemic and economic stagnation in wealthy countries, financial crisis, the imposition of this on the global South through imperialism. So it's a very difficult time in history. And I want to explain that the history isn't closed. So let me go into this, will be a philosophical and theoretical presentation. Nothing so clearly demonstrates the inherent limits of capitalist ideology as its innate denial of the future of history. The capitalist metaphysic, as John Paul Sartre critically observed, is one of a barred future. There is no exit from the system and its burning house. Even in the context of the present planetary emergency brought on by capital accumulation, Margaret Thatcher's well-known mantra that there is no alternative to the regime of capital, a view that she repeated so often that they nicknamed her Tina, continues to exercise its frozen grip on society. The notion of bourgeois society as the end or culmination of history intrinsic to liberal thought found its most powerful concrete expression in the 19th century writings of Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and particularly in his philosophy of right. In recent years, however, credit for the questionable notion that capitalism marks the termination of the historical process has often been attributed to Francis Fukuyama, based on his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man. In advancing the thesis of, quote, a universal and directional history leading up to liberal democracy, Fukuyama, who served as Deputy Director of Policy Planning and as Deputy Director of European Political Military Affairs for the US State Department during the George H.W. Bush administration, was really merely repackaging longstanding claims of liberal ideology in the context of the demise of the Soviet Union, which he took as representing the final defeat of socialism and the ultimate victory of capitalism, closing off history in any meaningful sense. Humanity, according to this hegemonic view, widely circulated in the 1990s, had reached its political, economic, ideological apex. There was no future beyond capitalism and liberalism. Yet a mere quarter century after the celebration of the so-called end of history in the permanence of the liberal order, humanity is confronted by a chain of catastrophic threats extending beyond anything that it is experienced in the long course of its development, all arising from the laws of motion of capitalism. In the present epochal crisis, multiple dire threats from economic stagnation in the capitalist core to the planetary ecological rift, to the epidemiological threat represented by COVID-19, to the renewed imperialism directed at the global South and the new Cold War on China, once again raising the question of nuclear holocaust, all threaten us. All rational responses to this age of threatened catastrophe point to the need for a global transformation aimed at surmounting capitalism's laws of motion and promoting a world of sustainable human development, that is socialism and ecology. As Karl Marx indicated in the 19th century, in those cases where capitalism leads to the ecological destruction of entire social formations and the extermination of the material basis of human existence, the choice left to working populations and their communities inevitably becomes one of, quote, ruin or revolution. Historically, revolutions have appeared globally in waves. The first stirrings of what can be conceived as a new revolutionary wave globally, different than the ones that came before, but emanating primarily from the global South, are now emerging in response to capitalism in the Anthropocene. This may seem optimistic, but I will explain why. This will likely expand rapidly with the decline of US world hegemony related to the rise of China. 21st century revolutionary praxis necessarily operates within a wider field than before, combining the struggles of socialism and ecology. It represents a new materiality of hope rooted in the movements of hundreds of millions of people, potentially billions, seeking to transcend the oppressions of class, race, gender, environmental injustice, and imperialism emanating from the empire of capital. These struggles necessarily entail new revolutionary vernaculars arising in specific historical and cultural contexts, embodying environmental as well as economic realities. In this sense, there is no single model of proletarian revolution. Rather, today's movements towards socialism and ecology encompass peasant and indigenous struggles, while converging in complex ways with the struggles of a still expanding industrial and post-industrial working class, confronting a rapidly changing environment engendered by capitalism's creative destruction. In all such instances, it is the combined mentality and materiality of the economy and the environment that now determines the terrain of resistance and revolt. Struggles that begin from an ecological basis, the most inclusive element of the material conditions shaping people's lives, are as vital as economic struggles and as crucial in the end in defining the class structure of society. Genuine revolutionary movements necessarily combine the two, shaping the nature and culture of social agency in our time. Today, the catastrophes unleashed by capitalism embrace not only the economy, but the entire environment of the planet, leading to the emergence everywhere of what can be called an environmental proletariat. Obviously, this isn't the standard view. The dominant view is, of course, that we are facing barriers to any kind of advance. That's the hegemonic ideology. In the Grundrisse, written in 1857-58, Marx famously described capital as a limitless drive to accumulate that accepted no boundaries outside itself, drawing on Hegel's dialectic of barriers and boundaries, in which barriers were understood as something to be surmounted, in contrast to boundaries which represented actual limits. Marx declared, "Capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barriers. Every boundary is and has to be a barrier for it. Else it would cease to be capital, money as self-reproductive. If it ever perceived a certain boundary not as a barrier, but became comfortable with it as a boundary, it would itself have declined from exchange value to use value, from the general abstract form of wealth to a specific substantial mode of the same. The quantitative boundary of the surplus value appears to it as a mere natural barrier, necessity which constantly tries to violate and beyond which it constantly seeks to go. Capital drives beyond national barriers and prejudices as much as beyond nature worship, as well as all traditional, confined, complacent, and encrusted satisfactions of present needs and reproductions of old ways of life. It is destructive towards all of this and constantly revolutionizes it, tearing down all barriers which hem in the development of the forces of production, the expansion of needs, the all-sided development of the forces of production, and the exploitation and exchange of natural and mental forces. But from the fact that capital posits every limit as a barrier and hence gets ideally beyond it, it does not by any means follow that it has really overcome it. And since every barrier contradicts its character, its production moves in contradictions, which are constantly overcome, but just as constantly posited. The constant positing of contradictions that are only ideally surmounted, but which nonetheless remain and accumulate over the course of capitalism to the point that more potentially catastrophic crises emerge, has to do with the fact that capital's creative destruction revolutionizes the world in ways limited by its own essential conditions of existence. The one boundary that is permanent, which can never be transgressed from the standpoint of capital, is the social relation of class-based accumulation itself. And thus it is to this artificially imposed boundary that all contradictions of the system can ultimately be traced. The true boundary to capitalist production, Marx wrote, is capital itself. The concrete result of this central contradiction of the capitalist system is that all transformations carried out by capital as part of its process of creative destruction are necessarily associated with fetters on sustainable human development in the form of alienated second-order mediations leading to ever more contradictory and catastrophic results as the system expands. The path to a world of sustainable human development is blocked at every point. It is this limit determined by the very nature of the system that now constitutes the fundamental basis of the planetary ecological and economic crisis engulfing the entire world, seemingly closing off the future as history. The more serious the social, economic, and ecological contradictions become, the more the ideological response of the system is to seal capitalism off from history, defining it as an immutable reality and denying all other possibilities. The universalization of the present in such a way as to portray the ruling ideas of society, which at the same time are both the ideas of the ruling class and the ideological bases of its rule, is common to all ruling classes, whether in the form of the divine right of kings or the invisible hand of capital. Such universalization, however, becomes more complex in those societies in which historical development is recognized. Here, what is above all required is the denial of the future through the decapitation of history, as Sartre called it. This decapitation of history is evident in the ubiquitous attempts of both mainstream modernist and postmodernist ideology to deny the historical specificity and thus the transitory character of capitalist social relations. Just as any future beyond capitalism is denied, so is capitalism's genesis presented in the conventional wisdom as predetermined, a mere coming to be of forces that were always present and simply waiting to be let free. The result is the systematic denial of any coherent theory of the historical origins of capitalism, which would contradict its innate and permanent character. As Marxian political theorist Ellen Masons Wood observed, accounts of the origin of capitalism are fundamentally circular, assuming the prior existence of capitalism in order to explain its coming into being. Capitalism seems to always be there somewhere, and it only needs to be released from its chains, for instance, from the fetters of feudalism, to be allowed to grow and mature. The notion that capitalism is natural and universal, and thus somehow ever present, only waiting for obstacles to be cleared away to its advance for it to emerge full bloom, can be traced back to the liberal possessive individualist view of human nature associated with thinkers from Thomas Hobbes to Adam Smith, the latter stipulating as the basis of his economic vision an inherent tendency of human beings to barter, truck, and exchange. And this view, which remains so dominant in present-day ideology, capitalism is simply human nature writ large. Max Weber in the 20th century was to expand on this fundamental bourgeois outlook by presenting capitalism as, quote, the most fateful force in our modern life, constituting the highest development of the formally rational instrumentalist culture that was uniquely identified in the Eurocentric perspective with the West. In Western civilization, and in Western civilization only, Weber wrote, were to be found cultural phenomena which, as we like to think, lie in a line of development having universal significance and value. Weber argued that other cultures civilizations had cultures of partial significance, but only a Western civilization had a culture that had universal significance and value. This naturalization of fundamental capitalist relations of production is deeply embedded within neoclassical economics, where historical elements hardly enter at all. In the prevailing reductionist view in the dismal science, the same abstract factors of production associated with capital are seen as common to absolutely all societies in all times. As Thorsten Veblen critically observed in 1908, a gang of Aleutian Islanders slushing about in the rack and surf with rakes and magical incantations for the capture of shellfish are held in point of taxonomic reality to be engaged on a feat of hedonistic equilibration in rent, wages, and interest. All situations are in point of economic theory substantially alike. Society is seen by conventional economists primarily in a positivistic mode in terms of invariant laws, of which the market in capitalism is the supreme expression. In this view, all historical laws associated with particular social systems as historically specific emergent forms of organization with their own properties are deemed false. All developments are in effect predetermined by universal, innate, unchanging properties, with capitalist modernity implicitly representing the ultimate working out of these fundamental principles. In line with this general loss of historical perspective, technology is often treated today as if it were innately capitalist, based on Joseph Schumpeter's famous notion of creative destruction, which was derived from Marx's conception of capitalism as a revolutionary technological force. The effect of this in current discussions has been to reinforce the belief in the immutability of capitalism with widespread notions of technological determinism, designating all progress as somehow uniquely capitalist and predestined. In the face of climate change, it is generally assumed in the prevailing outlook that all solutions to the most pressing social problems are technological, and all technologies that might conceivably address the dire challenges we face are compatible with capitalism. Central to this denial of historicity of both past and present, related to prevailing notions of economic and technological determinism, is the almost complete identification of capitalism with modernity. As sociologist Peter L. Berger put it in Capitalism and the Disorder of Modernity, capitalism is a thoroughly modern phenomenon, perhaps even the most modern phenomenon of all. The main alternative capitalism in terms of modernity were Soviet-type economies. But with their demise and the triumph of capitalism, there was seemingly no alternative to capitalism in the context of modernity. Indeed, many leftists themselves who came to accept the end of history, within capitalism itself, began to advance notions of post-modernity in which the future had been decapitated, emphasizing how capital and technological imperatives had annihilated all grand meta-historical projects. For cultural critic Leo Marx, the pessimistic tenor of postmodernism follows from the inevitably diminished sense of human agency. Here, the battle with capitalist modernity is reduced to a shadowy postmodern exercise in the cultural interstices of the system rather than a genuine emancipatory project. This perspective thus becomes one of disenchantment and de-enlightenment, a stance of perpetual, if somewhat detached and ironic defeat. As Wood wrote, in the final analysis, postmodernity for postmodernist intellectuals seems to be a historical moment, seems to be not a historical moment, but the human condition itself from which there is no escape. The cumulative effect of these various interconnected notions of capitalism as the end of history has been to enshrine capitalism as a permanent reality, more phenomenally real and of greater seeming importance to people's lives than the physical universe itself. Capitalism, in fact, is often presented as not only the end of history, but as the end of natural history, based in a conquest of nature that is often presented as its greatest achievement. Even with the advent of climate change, this hegemonic belief has not been shaken. Indeed, the notion that capitalism constitutes the ultimate boundary of human existence is so embedded in today's dominant ideology that, as Derek Jensen and Eric McBay wrote in What We Leave Behind, it gives rise to a cultural outlook in which there is an inversion of what is real and not real, where dying oceans and dioxin in every mother's breast milk are considered less real than industrial capitalism. Hence, we are constantly led to believe that the end of the world is less to be feared than the end of industrial capitalism. When most people in this culture ask, how can we stop global warming? That's not really what they are asking. They're asking, how can we stop global warming without significantly changing this lifestyle, or death style, as some call it, that is causing global warming in the first place? The answer is you can't. It's stupid, absurd, and it's a stupid, absurd, and insane question. It is this same ruling ideological view that Frederick Jameson was to capture in his famous aside. Someone once said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Nothing indeed so clearly captures the capitalist universalism parading as realism that dominates contemporary ideology, closing off the future as history. Confronted with the received ideology of a barred future, which denied the continuing role of revolution in human history, Sartre passionately declared, even a barred future is still a future. This adamant refusal to accept capitalism as a boundary that could never be crossed drew its essential meaning not simply from an abstract conception of human agency, but also from the fact that we live, as he said, in a time of incredible revolutions. The incredible revolutions emerging in our time, as in previous historical eras, are aimed at the ever wider social control of the means of production. Yet unlike some previous class struggles and revolutionary movements, this is no longer conceived today mainly in the narrow economic terms, but also increasingly in ecological terms, reflecting the fact that it is the social metabolism between human beings and nature that constitutes the most ineluctable basis of human history. The agent of revolution is increasingly a working class that is not to be conceived in its usual sense as a purely economic force, but also and increasingly as an environmental and cultural force, an environmental proletariat. From a historical materialist perspective, this should hardly surprise us. Most of the major class struggles and revolutionary movements over the centuries of capitalist expansion have been animated in part by what could be called ecological imperatives, such as struggles over land, food, and environmental conditions going beyond narrower political economic objectives. The English Revolution and French revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, respectively, each involved intense struggles over land ownership, represented by the diggers and levelers in the former and the Great Peasant Revolt in the latter. E.P. Thompson concluded his great work, The Making of the English Working Class, by indicating that no one else after William Blake, perhaps with the exception of William Morris, was fully at home in cultures of resistance against acquisitive man, that of the romantic criticism of utilitarianism rooted in struggles over land, aesthetics, and the environment, and that of the industrial workers fighting capital. In other words, Thompson's thesis was that there were two struggles against capitalism in the 19th century: the romantic struggle based on focusing on the land, the environment, and aesthetics, and the working class struggle focusing on particularly on the new factory conditions. And the fact that these two struggles did not come together was the greatest tragedy of the time. It was the separation of these two great movements, he argued, that led to, in the end, to a working class struggle that gravitated toward a resistance movement that, rather than a revolutionary challenge to capitalism. Yet it would be wrong to see this separation as ever being absolute. If the Romantics started with a struggle over the land and nature, they nevertheless, through radical figures like Shelley, Ruskin, and Morris, provided devastating critiques of bourgeois political economy, often overlapping with the working class struggle. The English proletariat in the 19th century fought an environmental struggle that was no less serious due to capitalism's total separation of the workers from the land and the annihilation of the environment for those laboring in the industrial cities. Frederick Engels' account of social murder in Manchester and other English factory towns in 1844 focused especially on the environmental conditions of the working class. Marx, partly inspired by Engels, wrote in 1844, even the need for fresh air ceases to be a need for the worker. Even the need for fresh air ceases to be a need for the worker. Man reverts once more to living in a cave, but the cave is now polluted by the mephitic and pestilential breath of civilization. Moreover, the worker has no more than a precarious right to live in it, for it is for him an alien power that can be daily withdrawn and from which, should he fail to pay, he can be evicted at any time. He actually has to pay for this mortuary, a dwelling in the light, which Prometheus describes in Aeschylus as one of the great gifts through which he transforms savages into men, ceases to exist for the worker. Light, air, etc., the simplest animal cleanliness ceases to be a need for man. Dirt, this pollution and putrefaction of man, the sewage, this word is to be understood in its literal sense, of civilization, becomes an element of life for him. Universal neglect, putrefied nature becomes an element of life for him. The proletariat was conceived by Marx as stripped of all direct connections to the means of production, notably the land and natural resources, as well as tools, factories, and machinery, on which all human existence depended. It was therefore forced into struggles over capitalism's one-sided destruction of the conditions of life and the environment, and compelled ultimately to enter into a battle over the entirety of human social metabolism with nature. The living conditions of the proletariat, Marx and Engels wrote in The Holy Family, represent the focal point of all inhuman conditions in contemporary society. It cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions which give it life. And it cannot abolish those conditions without abolishing all those inhuman conditions of social life today, which are summed up in its own situation. The question of materialism for classical historical materialism was therefore both about what Marx called the universal metabolism of nature and about the mode of production or social metabolism in a given historical case. The latter viewed as an emergent form of nature with its own properties. In this way, the materialist conception of nature developed by natural science and the materialist conception of history of scientific socialism were seen as dialectically connected. In Marx's analysis, the labor and production process was itself defined as the social metabolism of humanity and nature. Production was thus both a social relation between human beings and a socio-ecological relation between human beings and nature. If economic crises under capitalism were breaks in the accumulation of capital, ecological crises took the form of ruptures in the social metabolism such that the eternal natural conditions of this metabolism were undermined, as explained in Marx's famous theory of metabolic rift. In such a perspective, militant class struggles and revolutionary movements were engaged and engendered by contradictions that arose in the social metabolism of humanity and nature in both of its material aspects, political, economic, and natural environmental. Revolutionary movements did not simply emerge because of the fetters on the expansion of production, what could be seen as mere economic causes, but also as a result of the destruction of people's actual living conditions and of the natural conditions of production themselves. If in the former case, the potential of human development was undermined, in the latter, at least in the more dire instances, as in Ireland, in the mid-19th century, it became a case of, in Marx's words, ruin or revolution. It is this complex understanding of the struggle of land, nature, environment, which was crucial to classical historical materialism, that explains why Marx and Engels, while emphasizing the role of the proletariat as the leading revolutionary force in developed capitalist economies, never denied either the past or present significance of peasant revolts in the struggle against bourgeois society, an approach that also extended to their growing support from the late 1850s on for all indigenous struggles against colonialism. Thus, classical historical materialism, as distinct from some other socialist tendencies, never portrayed this peasantry as simply a reactionary class. The very issue of proletarianization in the age of so-called primitive accumulation, or the age of original expropriation, was connected to the enclosure of the commons and the overthrow of the customary rights of the workers. For Marx, this could not be explained in terms of some kind of economic determinism or the superior productivity of capitalism, but rather was the product of, quote, the opportunity that makes the thief. The populace was fully justified in defending their rights to the commons, that is, in their communal property rights. Indeed, the proletarian struggle itself pointed ultimately toward what Marx called the negation of the negation, what he called in Capital at the end of the section on so-called primitive accumulation, the negation of the negation, by which he meant the expropriation of the expropriators. In the classical historical materialist view, few things were more important than the abolition of the big land monopolies that divorced the majority of mankind, of humankind, that is, from a direct relation to nature. The land as a means of production and a communal relation to the earth. Marx delighted in quoting Herbert Spencer's chapter from his Social Statics in 1851 on the right to the use of the earth, where the latter stated, equity does not permit property in land, or the rest would live on the earth in sufferance only. It is impossible to discover any mode in which land can become private property. A claim to the exclusive possession of the soil involves landowning despotism. Land, Spencer declared, and Marx underscored, properly belongs to the great corporate body society. Human beings were, quote, co-heirs to the earth. The recognition that struggles over the land and peasant wars were integral to resistance to capitalism can be seen in Marx's statement in an 1856 letter to Engels that the whole thing, quote, the whole thing in Germany will depend on whether it is possible to back the proletarian revolution by some second edition of the peasant war. That is, through a struggle in which the urban proletariat and the rural peasantry, agricultural laborers, were both engaged, constituting a battle for both the cities and the land. In this, Marx was building on the implications of Engels' 1850, the Peasant War in Germany, on the Revolutionary War in Germany in the 16th century. In the context of the rise of revolutionary movements in Russia in the 1870s and 80s, Marx, at the end of his life, placed heavy emphasis on the archaic Russian commune and sided with the revolutionary Russian populace in seeing the peasantry, who were concerned above all with defending their customary collective relations to the land, as playing a crucial role in the coming Russian Revolution. It was this same perspective, focusing on the need of all direct producers throughout the globe for the collective control of their own means of production, thus opposing the expropriation of lands and bodies, that led to Marx and Engels' strong attacks beginning in the late 1850s on colonialism and the defense of revolts of indigenous people throughout the world. In particular, they supported indigenous revolts against expropriation and extermination in Ireland, India, China, Algeria, South Africa, and the Americas. With respect to the East Indies, Marx wrote, "Everyone but Sir Henry Maine and others of his ilk realizes that the suppression of communal land ownership out there was nothing but an act of English vandalism, pushing the native people not forwards but backwards." Likewise, criticizing the destruction by the British of the irrigation system of India and the famines leading to the deaths of millions of people, Marx pointed directly to Western ecological imperialism. Such a viewpoint anticipated the numerous peasant and proletarian-led peasant wars of the 20th century. Most of these Marxist-inspired revolutions, including those of Mexico, Russia, China, Vietnam, Algeria, and Cuba, all of which arose in the context of resistance to imperialism and all involved intense struggles over the land and the environment. In general, third world liberation movements have been aimed at both the environment and the economy, and have been struggles in which peasants and indigenous peoples have played central roles together with nascent proletarian and petty bourgeois forces. Often these wars of resistance and revolution have been waged by alliances between a proletariat and a peasantry jointly resisting imperialism, fighting for peace, bread, and land. For the great African Marxist liberation fighter Amilcar Cabral, the basis of revolutionary action in a colonial encounter required, quote, "a return to the source of indigenous culture associated with a given population's historical relations to its material environment." If capitalism begins with the extensive external expropriation of land and bodies everywhere, it then uses this as the basis from which it constructs a system of intensive internal exploitation of human labor. In this dual process of exploitation and expropriation, capitalist private property exhausts the environmental conditions of production and life, seeking to externalize this destruction onto the wider social and ecological realms on a global basis, at the same time producing periodic and increasing economic crises. It follows that as capitalism proceeds with its accumulation on an increasingly global scale, its destruction simply knows no barriers, extending to the world environment as a whole. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels captured this increasingly one-sided yet all-encompassing destructive character of capitalist production. In the development of productive forces, they wrote, "There comes a stage when productive forces and means of intercourse are brought into being, which under the existing relations only cause mischief and are no longer productive, but destructive forces. These productive forces receive, under the system of private property, a one-sided development only. And for the majority, they become destructive forces. Moreover, a great many of these forces can find no application at all within the system of private property. And just a note here, this is an observation by Marx that not all technology, not all forward-looking technology is possible under capitalism. Labor and production now diverge to such an extent that material life appears as the end, and what produces this material life, labor, as the mere means. Thus, things have now come to such a place, such a pass, that the individuals must appropriate the existing totality of productive forces, not only to achieve self-activity, but also merely to safeguard their own existence. It was, in fact, the perception of the, quote, negative, that is destructive side of capitalist production that Marx sought to capture in his theory of the metabolic rift. His analysis here focused initially on the rift in the soil metabolism associated with the export of soil nutrients with the food and fiber sent to the new densely populated urban areas of capitalism. This contributed to the pollution of the cities together with the loss of soil fertility in rural areas. Similar rifts or ruptures in the social metabolism between humanity and nature, Marx recognized, were common to capitalism's entire expropriation of nature and materialized in innumerable ways, not least of all, as he pointed out, in, quote, periodic epidemics. Engels's condition of the working class in England, which provided the original materialist understanding of the proletariat that was to be the basis of historical materialism, was concerned with the growth of the industrial working class in the new manufacturing towns and introduced the concept of the industrial reserve army of the unemployed, which is crucial to the workings of the entire system of capital accumulation. But most of Engels's analysis in his book was devoted to the social epidemiology of working class life and the etiology of disease. The combination of the critique of political economy with the critique of environmental and epidemiological conditions and their relation to the reproduction of the laboring class under capitalism helps us to understand the enormous radicalism of that time, just 2 years after the 1842 general strike or plug plot riots, in which factory workers were struggling simultaneously against the economic and environmental degradations of capitalism. The movements for economic justice in the 19th century and into the 20th century were accompanied by struggles for environmental justice. Socialists, and particularly Marxists in the early 20th century, were to pioneer in the development of an ecological critique, side by side and dialectically interconnected with historical materialism's economic critique. Today, with a planetary ecological crisis, environmental hazards are everywhere, extending from climate change to ocean acidification, to the sixth extinction, to the disruption of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, to deforestation and the loss of ground cover, to desertification, to ubiquitous pollution by synthetic chemical and radioactive waste, to pandemics, to the destruction of the soil metabolism. These destructive influences are now part of our daily lives, from heat waves to megastorms to rising sea levels to COVID-19 and other pandemics. Marx's original notion on the was based primarily on the work of the great German chemist Justus von Liebig. Marx's original notion of the metabolic rift was based on the work of Liebig. who dealt with degradation of the soil through the loss of soil nutrients. And but today we see this in more complex ways in terms of the loss of soil organic matter or soil carbon, a factor that contributes to climate change. So this same analysis of the destruction of the soil has now been carried much further. Everywhere we are confronted with the reality that capitalism has generated a new geological epoch of the Anthropocene, in which the human economy is now the main driver of geological time, disrupting Earth system relations to the point that changes that previously would have only taken place over millions of years are now occurring in decades. All material struggles are now environmental class as well as economic class struggles, with the separation between the two fading in people's material lives. More and more it is becoming clear to humanity as a whole that the needed revolutionary break with the system is not simply a question of removing capitalism's fetters on human advance, but beyond that, and more importantly, countering its systematic destruction of the earth as a place of human habitation and the habitat of innumerable other species. A question, to repeat Marx's phrase, and also employed by Engels in Anti-During, a question of ruin or revolution. The objective reality of this changing environment, the product of an uncontrolled imperialist capitalist globalization and accumulation arising from forces at the center of the system, is inevitably to create a more globally interconnected revolutionary struggle, a new eco-revolutionary wave emanating primarily from the global south, but with rapidly developing transnational alliances reflecting the undermining of the material conditions for the chain of human generations throughout the planet. In this emerging global conflict, economic struggles are only meaningful if they are also environmental struggles, while environmental movements must equally be economic ones. Ultimately, it requires, as Cabral stated, a return to the source, drawing vital insights from historic, customary, communal, collective cultures, including obviously rural cultures, which have to be reinvented, their principles enlarged under the conditions imposed by capitalism in the Anthropocene. The best way to understand these multiple challenges is in terms of the objectively conditioned role of an emerging environmental proletariat, engaged with promoting a new, more unified social materiality aimed at a world of sustainable human development. All conscious action has the future as its object, which cannot realistically be conceived today apart from ecological revolution. The prospect of a new eco-revolutionary wave is foreshadowed by the various movements and struggles throughout the world, including the landless workers movement, the MST in Brazil, the International Peasants Alliance, La Via Campesina, Venezuelans' nascent, if now besieged, communal state, Cuba's revolutionary ecology and epidemiology, and making it the most sustainable society on Earth, based on socialist principles, the resource nationalist and post-colonial movements in Africa, the farmers' revolt in India, China's goal of a socialist-based ecological civilization, sparked in part by its rural reconstruction movement, the student-led climate strikes in Europe, the Green New Deal, Red New Deal, just transition, environmental justice, Black Lives Matter struggles in the United States and Canada, the revival on every inhabited continent of indigenous environmental struggles. Everywhere these radical movements occurring at multiple levels are finding ways to unite with more traditional workers' struggles and calls for a new international of workers and peoples. This is an objective tendency as the very serious crisis, planetary crisis, both ecological and economic and related to imperialism that we're caught in now develops further, and it will develop further given climate change, pandemics, given financial boom and crisis. We're going to see more and more integration of economic and environmental struggles around a common based materialism. Almost unlooked for, indigenous struggle around the world has come to play a leading role in the development of what could be called a broad-based environmental proletarian revolt. In his book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the long tradition of indigenous resistance, Red Nation leader Nick Estes writes, indigenous people must lead the way. Our history and our long traditions of indigenous resistance provide possibilities for futures premised on justice. After all, indigenous resistance is animated by our ancestors' refusal to be forgotten. And it is our resolute refusal to forget our ancestors and our history that animates our vision for liberation. Indigenous revolutionaries are the ancestors from the before, and the already forthcoming. There is a capaciousness to indigenous kinship that goes beyond the human. Whereas past revolutionary struggles have strived for the emancipation of labor from capital, we are challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of the earth from capital. For the earth to live, capitalism must die. And, to understand indigenous struggles, we have to, of course, look beyond simply the indigenous struggles that are occurring in the Americas around environmental issues, and also see indigenous struggles as taking place all over the world, on all of the inhabited continents. And this is a crucial perspective. It's a perspective that Marx and Engels actually had, as Brett Clark, Hannah Holloman, and I have explained in our essay on Marx and the indigenous. In the dire conditions of the Anthropocene epoch, there is no answer for the human world that does not address the triple threats of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. In this sense, history, rather than having come to an end, as claimed by received ideology, is today entering its most decisive phase. Hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions, have now entered actively into the struggle for a world of substantive equality and ecological sustainability, constituting the fundamental meaning of socialism and the future of history in our time. Yet the planetary revolt of humanity in the 21st century will prove irresistible and irreversible, and thus succeed against all odds only if it takes the form of a more unified, revolutionary human subject emanating from the wretched of the earth, an environmental proletariat. As Bertolt Brecht once said, it is time to exit the burning house. So that's the end of my formal comments, and I know that I have had more time than this, but let me just add a few things about the general perspective that I'm providing here. For a long time, I have been advancing this notion of the environmental proletariat, which stands for the idea that Marxism, historical materialism, is a materialist critique. And the material is the material conception of history is accompanied for Marx and Engels by the materialist conception of nature, which was developed by natural science and with which they were fully conversant. And material conditions are seen as not simply economic, as I was taught when I studied Marxism initially, but material conditions are also ecological. That is, they relate to our natural conditions, the social metabolism between human beings and the earth. And in the most revolutionary periods, when we've seen revolutionary uprisings against capitalism, they've always involved both economic and ecological elements. To restrict the struggle to one or the other is fatal, but to combine the two is to create a far more revolutionary project, as was discovered in all the great revolutions, including the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. We could go down the line. So this is a fundamental perspective. And the argument is that objectively we are being pushed in this direction. There's no way that people say who are struggling for food or water or for breathable air or trying to survive in increasing heat waves or trying to find a way to deal with rising sea levels. There's no way, and at the same time confronted with economic crises, loss of income, and so on, there's no way that in our age that the economic and the environmental won't be combined together. They will be seen, perceived by people on the ground at the most basic level, and they are being perceived this way, as a common material struggle. And it's increasingly becoming clear that our economic struggles, our environmental struggles, our cultural and aesthetic struggles are one material struggle that pushes humanity in a revolutionary direction because it's now become a question of ruin or revolution. For a long time, the slogan of socialism has been socialism or barbarism. And that's usually attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, and she herself attributed it to Engels. But you can't find in Marx or Engels a direct reference to socialism or barbarism. What did they say? They said ruin or revolution. They said that they pointed, and Marx specifically pointed in the case of Ireland, to extermination, which meant in the classical sense, extermination means both mass killing of people and their removal from the land and destruction of their culture. It's all encompassed in the classical notion of extermination. So forced immigration is part of the concept, but they saw Irish society as being faced by extermination and the only ruin, and their land being destroyed, their living conditions being destroyed, and the only recourse was revolution, which the Irish periodically resorted to. And Engels in Anti-Düring also refers to the destructive nature of capitalism and ruin or revolution. What I'm saying now is that it's no longer socialism or barbarism, although barbarism is a threat. We're seeing fascism, neo-fascism develop all over the world. But the real fundamental material issue, which we have to address, even if we're going to face up to the questions posed by the new right, but we have to face no matter what, it's ruin or revolution. And if socialist theorists haven't comprehended this, if Marxist theorists haven't fully comprehended this, and I think they haven't to the extent that they should, people on the ground, the movements that I referred to, they understand this. They understand increasingly all over the world, particularly in the global South, that it's now a question of ruin or revolution, and that we have common material struggles. We're divided by imperialism, especially, as well as class. Any movement has to start at the bottom with class alliances. It has to be an anti-imperial struggle, but it has to have a broader sense of materialism in which we recognize that food and land and water, ironically, this was understood by Lenin at the time of the Russian Revolution, that these issues are as fundamental or more fundamental for people than mere wage struggles, and that we have to bring back what existed at the beginning, a broader conception of materialism, a broader conception of the working class, of the proletariat, a broader, more all-encompassing, more irresistible and irreversible, in Sartre's words, concept of revolution. Thank you.